This is question 2 from the final exam review worksheet. And here we're supposed to plot the Q output of a gated D latch given the inputs below. Assume that Q is initially 0. So it's a gated D latch. If you go back to problem 1, I talk about the different kinds of latches and flip-flops. And a gated latch means that it can change when the clock is 1, but it doesn't change when the clock is 0. So what I like to do with these kind of problems is to draw vertical lines that will show me when the clock changes so that I can see when the output changes. So I'll just draw vertical lines here where the clock changes. And that will help me when I am trying to draw the output to know when to make a change and when not to make a change, because it can only change while the clock is 1. And this makes it different from an edge-triggered flip-flop, because an edge-triggered flip-flop only changes once at each clock cycle. It's only going to change at the positive edge or the negative edge depending on what kind of flip-flop it is. But gated can change the entire time that the clock is 1. And so it will follow, since this is a D gated latch, D follows the input, or the Q will follow the D, and that's how a D latch works, that the output will be whatever the D input is. And as soon as I'm done here, okay, so these lines will just help guide me as we're drawing our output. So we assume that Q is initially 0, and it's shown here, and the clock is 0 to start off with, and so Q will be 0. It cannot change while the clock is 0, so it stays 0. Now while the clock is 1, Q will follow D. So when the clock is 1, D is 1, so Q becomes 1. And it stays the same as D throughout the clock whenever the clock cycle is 1. So D is 1 the entire time the clock is 1, so is Q. Now, when we get to the clock being 0, Q can't change anymore because there's not going to be any change while the clock is 0, so it will stay at 1. Now, when the clock is 1 again, Q will follow D. So D here is 0, so Q will become 0. And then the clock is 1, so it can change. So when the D input changes, the Q input changes, so it'll become 1 here. And now the clock is 0, so it has to stay 1 for the entire time the clock is 0. Now the clock is 1, so once again Q will follow D. So it's 0 here, and it becomes 1 here. And then it stays 1, and then the clock is 0, so it does not change while the clock is 0. The clock is 1 and D is 1, so Q will be 1. The clock is 0, so there's no change. Now the clock is 1, so the Q output will follow the D input. The D input here is 0, and then it changes to 1, and then it changes back to 0, and then it will stay like that. Now, how would this be different if we had, say, a positive edge triggered? D flip-flop. And let's call that Q1. So positive edge triggered can only change once each clock cycle, and it's positive edge, so it can only change on the positive edge of the clock cycle. So I'm going to mark where the positive edge is on each one. Oh, I'm making a mess. Okay, so we'll mark where the positive edge is for each one. Oh, I wonder if I can do that on all of them. Oh, nice. So I changed the vertical lines to red whenever it was the positive edge of the clock. And the positive edge of the clock is when it goes from 0 to 1. So whenever it goes from 0 to 1, I changed that line to red to guide me as I'm drawing my output. So Q starts with at 0, and so it'll stay at 0 through the negative clock here. And then the clock becomes 1. So we have a positive edge. So at the positive edge, look to see what D is. D is 1. So Q will become 1. And it can only change once. So it'll be 1 all the way until the next positive edge. Now at the next positive edge, we'll look at the input D. And we see that the input D is 0. So that means that Q1 will become 0. And once it's 0, it has to stay 0 all the way till the next positive edge. At the next positive edge, let's look and see what D is. D is 0, so Q1 will be 0, and it'll stay 0 all the way to the next positive edge. The next positive edge, if you look at what D is 1, so Q will become 1, and it'll stay 1 all the way to the next positive edge. And then at this last positive edge, we see that D is 0, so Q will become 0, and it will stay that way.